Hello and welcome. In this video I'm going to be covering how to install CentOS using the graphical Anaconda installation tool, specifically on CentOS 7. I'm going to preface this by saying, yes, I'm aware CentOS 7 is, if not obsolete, at least deprecated by this point. You should probably be using one of the more recent releases. I am doing this in aid of some of my students who are taking a course who are still using CentOS 7 for reasons I am not going to explain here. When you first boot to the installation media, you get this menu giving you the options to either install CentOS 7. This would apply to whichever version you would have. You see this menu on any of them. Or to test this media and install CentOS. If you've used this media to install in the past, you can probably skip the testing step, but if this is the first time you've used it, you probably do want to go through that testing process just to make sure it downloaded correctly and there's not any odd errors in the ISO file. Now, normally when you first boot up to this, it's going to actually give you I think it's a 30-second countdown before it automatically picks this. I deliberately stopped that countdown right before I stopped the video, so I would have time to explain this. So I'm just going to hit enter to test this media and install. It helps if I'm focused on that window. And we can see about halfway down the window there that it is just running through a checking process. It's scanning the ISO to make sure it can actually read all of it. It will count up to 100%, and assuming there are no errors, it starts the installation process. If you had picked the menu option to just start the install, it would skip that check and go right here. Now, because of the tool that I'm using, I'm just going to resize this to full screen so it's a little bit more readable. I happen to be in Canada, so the language I'm going to use during the installation process is English Canada. And this takes us to the main settings for the installation, where we can pick how we want this machine to be configured. So we can set the current time zone and whether or not we'll be using network time protocol. We can change the keyboard, the language settings. We can change, we can't change, but we can identify where software is going to be installed from and exactly what we want to have installed. We can pick how we're going to format the storage for this device. We can set its network connection and host name, and we're not even going to touch the security policy. I'm going to start with a network connection and host name because really I'd like to start with the time zone, but one of the settings that I want to use there relies on having a functional network connection. So we click this button. It gives us a nice graphical interface to set the machine's host name. I'm going to set this to demo.demodomain.ops. And so when this machine is installed, that is the host name that it will take. Its network connection defaults to being off, which is probably not what we want. So we can click a nice button here to configure that. There's a variety of settings. We're probably mostly concerned with the IPv4 and IPv6 settings. Both of these are set to try to automatically get an IP address. The courses I teach, we still are not teaching IPv6 yet, so I'm actually going to set that to ignore. IPv4, well, we can choose to either get a DHCP address, which if we haven't pre-planned our network configuration, that's probably what we're getting. Or if we wanted to put in a static address, we could do that. Click Manual, click Add, type in the address, 192.168.122 dot something. It will guess at the net mask that should be applied to that. You can correct that if it doesn't match up to the actual network. You can put in the gateway. That is your default route to get out of this network. If you have DNS servers configured in your network, you can put in the IP address of those now. If you had multiple ones, just comma and another. And if you know the domain that this machine is going to exist in, you can put that in as well, so it will automatically search for machines in that domain if you do something like SSH to a host name but not the fully qualified domain name. Now I've typed all this in, but I'm actually going to set this machine to DHCP. And get rid of all of those settings. So it will automatically take its address. We set that to on, and the machine will attempt to get that DHCP address that I assigned, or that my network will assign for it. It stays in on, it tells us the IP address that it's going to get, its subnet mask, the default route, the DNS server, all provided by the DHCP server. With that done, now I can go set the time zone, and you can either pick it out of a drop-down list for the general continent and city within that continent, or you can use the graphical interface to just pick the city you're in. You can then click network time. Most of the time, this should probably be set to on. If you're just configuring a standalone machine to test out some software, or that really is just going to exist on its own, you could leave that off, but most of the time you probably want this to be on. There are a number of services you might be using that would require the accuracy you get from using network time. The software you install, you can pick just how much of an operating system you want to have installed initially. With minimal install, you're getting a command line, you're getting the basic things that exist on a service or its server, but you're not getting, say, other services to provide resources to other machines in the network. You're not getting, say, a print server or a web server or a machine that will be immediately able to host other virtual machines. So, I mean, yes, you could always install whatever packages you need later on, but if you know this machine is going to provide some set of resources, you could pick the option that is most appropriate. For the course that I'm doing this to assist for, to act as a reference for, we're actually using the GNOME desktop installation. It will then double check that what you have asked to install is actually available in your installation media. Assuming everything's okay, those little yellow triangles disappear, or orange, I guess. If they did not, you would get an error message. You know, maybe if you hadn't downloaded the full install media, maybe you had a limited one, it could tell you that's not available. Your installation destination is where you are actually going to be creating the file systems for this machine and how you're going to be formatting them. It still has this little orange triangle telling you you must configure this before you continue. Only once you've dealt with all the little orange triangles is the button to begin installation going to become available. So we'll click there, and we could potentially leave it with automatically configure partitioning and just click done, but I'm not going to do that. Generally, we want a little bit more control over that. Now, in this case, I'm installing a virtual machine, so I've already pre-configured a disk for it. However, if you were installing this with physical install media on an actual physical machine, you might potentially see more than one drive listed here. And that's where you have to be very, very careful to make sure you're picking the correct drive. Whether that's by just double checking the sizes of each one, or starting up this boot process a few times, well, one without your drive plugged in to see what the other drives look like, and then plug it in, and just by process of elimination, you should be able to figure it out. Now, I am going to click I will configure partitioning because I want to do something a little bit more custom than the default partitioning, though the default is generally pretty good. I click done. It's not actually finished. It takes me to another window to set up that partitioning. Now, potentially, I still have the option here to have it create a set of partitions automatically, which again, for most use cases, the defaults are pretty good. However, in the case of this particular course that this is acting as a reference for, they're not sufficient, and it's partially there to teach students how to actually set up their file systems. So we are going to manually, one by one, click the button to add a new mount point and set some settings for that mount point. You'll notice as this happens, the total space available on the disk is not going to change. It was configured with 238 gigs. That's what it has. As we start divvying up some of that space and allocating it to different file systems, you'll see the remaining available space decrease. So I'll click a button, and this gives us the option to identify the location of where this mount point will be or where this will be attached to our system, and initially how big this is going to be, how much of our space we're going to allocate to that particular volume. And in a moment, we'll be able to choose things like file system type. So I'm just going to quickly pop into the other window and bring up the lab that this is supposed to be in support for, so that I can pick settings exactly matching what my students are going to see in that course. Because no, I don't remember the exact details off the top of my head. So the first one we're setting is not immediately visible. /boot EFI, and the size that we're setting for that, 2954. Add mount point. And now we could update other settings. It does default as a standard partition, not a logical volume partition, and because we set that to /boot/EFI, it auto detects that it is supposed to be an EFI system partition. And we can already see the available space has decreased a bit because I allocated some of it. I'll add another mount point. In this case, what I'm looking for is /boot, and that is supposed to be 500 megs. And we'll double check. Default settings, it's a standard partition, it's XFS. Great. We'll add another mount point for root, and that is supposed to be, according to the lab, 30720. In this case, though, we change this to ext4 because in this course we will do some stuff with changing the size of our volumes up and down, and XFS does not support shrinking of a volume. So I will click Update Settings because I made a change there. I will allocate /home, so the home directories for all my users, If we had set or picked the automatically configure the partitions, the system would allocate most of the space to /home because it would expect you're going to have multiple users, they each need some space, so you would see a significant amount of storage space used there. In the case of what I'm doing in this course though, we only actually have, I think, 2 or 3 users, but we set up multiple nested virtual machines, so we need a lot more space for virtual machines than we do for home directories. I'll still provide 40 gigabytes, and a nice little shortcut here, instead of having to manually do the math to turn megabytes into gigabytes like I kind of did for the previous one, you can just type in GIB, or if you wanted the other form of gigabytes, GB, and it will sort out how many megs that should be for you. Again, we're going to double check that this is a logical volume and ext4 because potentially we might grow or shrink this as needed, and because we made a change, update settings. Now I'm going to set up a volume for where our virtual machines are going to be stored, and on CentOS that defaults to var lib. Helps if I type it right. Var lib libvirt images. You'll notice I had to manually type that one because it does not exist as a default in the dropdown. You could select /var and type the rest if you wanted. At that point, you may as well just type all of it. We're going to allocate a significant amount of space for virtual machines because that is where most of the space on this machine is going to get used. Of course, if you had a different plan for the virtual machine that you're installing, you would allocate your space differently. And we do want some swap space for this machine. Oh, before I do that, I'll go and make that mistake and come back and correct it. So we do want some swap space for this machine, so if we identify it as swap, the amount of space that we want, I've got a fair amount of storage here, so I'll allocate a fair amount for swap space. And you'll notice I still have 48 gigs left available. I'm going to leave that available so that if I need to allocate some unexpected space later on, I have almost 50 gigs ready to do that with. Generally a good idea to leave yourself a little bit of wiggle room there. Now, I mentioned that I made a mistake that I wanted to come back and correct. If we, for example, hadn't set a volume type correctly, you can always click that volume you've identified you're going to create. The side panel here will change to present the information about that particular volume, and you can change those settings as need be. And I will demonstrate what happens if I don't click update settings, if I just switch to a different one. If I go back, well, surprise, surprise, it actually automatically saved it for me. Don't depend on that, though. If you were changing one of these settings, click update settings. Now, when we think this all looks good, we can click done. It presents a list of what it expects or what it is planning to do. If that all looks good, we can accept our changes. It takes us back to this main menu. And we can finally, if we've done everything else, click begin installation. At this point, we get the option to create 2 users, our root password. In the case of CentOS 7, all we're doing here is setting, or the Anaconda installer for CentOS 7. All we can do is set the password for this user. With some of the newer versions, you can even lock off access to this user or decide whether or not people can SSH to this user. Generally a bad idea to allow that. For now, though, we're just going to put in a password. pick something secure, pick something that won't be easily guessable. If somebody has this password, they can get access to this root account and they can do absolutely anything to your system. Not a great password. You'll notice it only became strong right at the end there. I'm not going to delve into the details of what makes a good secure password, and I am going to delete this machine as soon as this video is done, so I'm not too terribly concerned about making a properly strong password for it. A lot of the time you will want to create an initial user to exist on this system, though depending on exactly what is in your network, you may not be relying on local definitions for user accounts. You will often be relying on a server somewhere else in the network that has the complete list of what users exist, what are their passwords, when are they allowed to log in, what do they get access to, and where their home directory is. So I'm going to create my user, my alter ego and admin. It does default set up the login name for the user. I like to use first name dot last name. Different organizations have different details for that. Follow whatever the organizational details say to use. Some senior administrator somewhere has come up with a plan of how your user should be named. It's pretty much guaranteed you should have an account, a password to log into this account, so you'll enter a password for them. If this user is just supposed to represent a normal user and will not have the capability to administer things on this system, like change configuration for services, add other users, update the firewall, we could click done right now. However, generally this first user is going to be an administrative user. That is, they are going to have the authority to make significant changes to the system, like update the firewall, install new software, create or manage other users. So you will often want to check this box to make this user an administrator. This will, I'm sure I believe I already have a video talking about the details of this. This will add this user to the group called wheel that will give them sudo permissions to run whatever command they would like to with administrative privileges when they need to. So we'll click done, and this is currently trying to install all the software packages that represent the version of the operating system that I picked. So in this case, I picked GNOME Desktop, so there's a fair number of packages that need to be installed. If we had picked, say, minimal install, that count is only something like 300, so the install would go much faster. Now, rather than having this video be several minutes of silence while we watch this counter go up, I'm just going to go and I'm going to pause my recording, and when that counter gets close to complete, I will unpause. So I will see you again in a moment. And I'm back. The counter is almost at the end. That was a great time to go take a break or get coffee or whatever else. As the installation finishes, a button is going to appear offering to reboot the machine. whenever it feels like it's ready to do so. Okay, I'm just going to pause again until it's ready. Okay, after some more time, it is finally ready. You can see the bar has moved to complete. There's a button now visible to reboot. And once we click that, it boots. One last step is to accept the end user license agreement. That basically says it's open source software, no guarantees or warranties of any kind, and it's licensed under GPL version 2. We click accept, done. We have a chance to update the hostname and network information if we wanted to. I demonstrated how to set that during install, but if you realized you needed to adjust something, there's an opportunity to do so. And I guess it decided the terminal was a different size. I'll resize to the VM so we can see that button. Finish configuration. And the machine is fully installed. So this video was I wouldn't say quick, it's close to a half-hour long, demonstration of using the interactive version of the Anaconda installer tool to install CentOS 7. I will probably in the future be making videos for, say, a network install using a kickstart file just to show how we might use that as well. And I will probably make several videos for, I'll probably skip CentOS 8 because there's now already CentOS 9. I'm really only doing 7, again, because some of the courses that I teach are, for reasons I won't explain here, still using it. But theoretically, the more modern ones would be more useful. So thank you, and I will see you in those videos.